One afternoon, Percy was bringing some trucks to Edward's station. It was a simple task, but he didn't mind. It had been a while since he last left Thomas's branch line, and he enjoyed seeing other sights of Sodor. He especially loved the viaduct that stretched across a huge valley, with a calm and clean river below. It was a wonderful sight. Percy was also very fond of Edward, and was looking forward to seeing him again. The feeling was clearly mutual, as the old engine smiled when he heard the little green engine's whistle. Percy brought his trucks into the station, and Edward pulled up alongside him. "Hello, Percy," he said. "How have things been?" "Oh, very well, thank you," replied Percy cheerfully. "I've had good runs, and the trucks have been behaving." "Very good. And what about Thomas? He's getting along all right?" "Oh, he's doing good. A bit of a handful sometimes," chuckled Percy. "Though I did put him in his place one time, when I made him think I was a ghost." "A ghost?" laughed Edward. "Do tell." Percy explained the time he crashed into a cart of lime, and he was as white as a ghost. "It was just after I told him about this ghost of an engine who fell into a gap or something like that, and he called me a silly little engine." Edward's face suddenly darkened. "Into a gap, you say?" "Yes, though driver said it was a made-up one on the television. It wasn't actually real." "Yes, well, I wouldn't say it was entirely made up," said Edward quietly. Percy was confused. "You mean driver did see a real ghost?" "Oh, no, that's not what I meant, Percy. I'm sure what your driver saw on television was a fictional story, but sometimes fiction can be based on truth. This engine that fell into a gap, I'm all too familiar with it. It's actually well known amongst those who know Sodor's history." "Well, what's it about?" asked Percy. "I can share it if you want, but I must warn you, it's not a pleasant tale." Percy thought. Edward wouldn't usually give a warning before telling a story, so he was feeling a little nervous. In the end, though, his curiosity got the better of him. "Please, tell me," he finally said. "Very well," sighed Edward. And so, he began. A long time ago, the island of Sodor consisted of several smaller railways that were disconnected from one another. Eventually, though, plans were made to have them all joined together as one, creating what we now know as the Fat Controllers Railway. This change included many developments, digging tunnels, forming new stations, and one in particular, constructing a huge viaduct across the valley, which still stands today. To assist with all of this, a tank engine was brought in from the mainland to work on one of the smaller railways. This engine was unusual. It was a newly built prototype, one of a kind. As it was rushed to the island, it never got a name, a number, or even a proper paint job. It still wore its grey undercoat, which wore off very easily. The engine had nothing, and eventually picked up the name Zero. Now, Zero wasn't a bad sort, from what workers and engines have said. In fact, it was rather friendly, and always eager to please. It was truly a shame, then, that it wasn't a very successful engine. Being an early prototype, Zero came with many faults in its design that greatly hindered its performance. You know how Henry used to be before his rebuild at Crewe? It was like that, except it wasn't a small firebox. Rather, Zero lacked any real pulling power. It could pull trains and shunt trucks, but struggled greatly with heavier loads. For many of the other engines on the railway, it was seen as a great source for teasing. and bullying. Zero would often find itself in a corner as endless arrays of insults were thrown at it. "You keep to the sidings, weakling," the engines said. "Make way for the proper engines." Zero never had the strength to fight back. It tried its best to be useful, but the heavy workloads and constant berating from others made life harder than it already was. There were a small handful of engines that stood by Zero's side and gave as much support as possible, though it seemed to do no good. Then, one fateful night, everything changed. There was an evening passenger train bound for the last station on the line, just before the valley where the viaduct was still being built. However, the engines scheduled for the train had broken down, and no one else was available. Except for Zero. There was much concern from many as Zero backed onto the coaches. The engine itself was determined. No matter the strain, it would ensure the train would reach the other end of the line. Once the guard's whistle had sounded, Zero huffed and puffed out of the station. Its cheeks were already red when the last coach left the platform, but it carried on regardless. The train wasn't going too slow, but for Zero it wasn't enough. It tried even harder, and eventually reached a more favourable pace. By that point, however, they were far behind schedule. Not far from the station, they approached a loop where a goods train sat waiting. The engine stared in disbelief at Zero and scowled at it. "Pathetic," it wheezed. "To think that you believe you could be worthy of a train like that. Do yourself a favour, weakling. Throw yourself off the line when you're done. We don't need engines like you." Now, no one is certain what happened next. Zero's driver said the regulator just stopped working, and they couldn't slow down. The goods engine claimed that when the insult was thrown, Zero looked furious, almost deranged. Whatever the reason, the train began going faster and faster. The engine's wheels blurred, and the coaches rattled violently. The last station came into view, but the train merely sped past, startling all who stood on the platform. Once they realized this, the guards slammed on the brakes in the van. The only result was loud screeching wheels, firing huge sparks in all directions. The driver and fireman fought for control, pressing hard on the regulator and brakes. All attempts were futile. Zero didn't slow. In fact, it seemed to be going even faster. It quickly sunk in where they were heading. They were now on a long stretch of line, and at the end, the valley. The valley came closer and closer. Workmen who were on a night shift ran to safety. The driver only saw one option. He grabbed a pole and thrusted it into the fireman's hands. "Quick, get out there and uncouple the train!" Any fear the fireman had was ignored, as he clambered out the cab and waddled on the running board. Holding onto the bunker, he reached down and tried to grab the chain with the pole. The swaying engine nearly had him lose his footing several times, and it seemed impossible to pull the chain. But he tried, over and over and over again. And then, "Got it!" he shouted as he lifted the chain off the hook. The coaches began trailing behind, and the crew leapt off the engine. As for Zero, well, no one knew what it was thinking. No one got a chance, as it left the rails and plunged into the gap. Edward took a deep breath. He was so focused on his story, he hadn't really been looking at Percy. Not surprisingly, when he did, the little green engine was in shock. The passenger train thankfully stopped before reaching the end. Not one human was harmed. Rightfully so, the driver and fireman were dubbed heroes of the railway. They showed remarkable bravery in such a dire situation. There wasn't much care for their engine though, Edward sighed. The remains were fished out and left in the yard. Some parts were salvageable, but otherwise, zero was lost. No one seemed to really care. By that point, some other engines had already been bought or loaned. And so, the engine is now a ghost? Percy asked, timidly. Edward looked down at his buffers, pondering. Well, that's more so speculation, Percy. Some say that every year, on the date of the accident, it runs again. Not as a danger, as some believe, but as a warning to others. And some even claim to have seen it, plunging into the gap, shrieking like a lost soul. But how true that is, I can't really say. Such a shame, said Percy. I would have liked to have met this Zero. It did sound like a nice engine. Indeed, replied Edward softly. If it did meet you, I have no doubt you would have made it feel very welcome. Soon it was evening, and it was time to return home. Percy said goodbye to Edward and set off down the main line. Eventually, Percy arrived at the viaduct. It was his usual appearance, standing tall and proud above the river. What should be a highlight of the journey, though, now felt very unsettling. Percy peered down into the valley, a chill running in his boiler. He could picture it now. An engine, out of control, leaping off the line, and just falling. He looked away and puffed safely across the viaduct, staying completely silent out of respect.